All eyes will be on Helsinki, Finland this Monday when President Trump sits down with Vladimir Putin for an historic summit. Prior to leaving for Europe, the president predicted that meeting Putin, quote, may be the easiest of all the sit-downs he has scheduled on his trip. But he may have complicated things this morning when he declared that Germany is captive to Russia because of their dependence on Russian dirty gas. So who will have the upper hand and the face-off in Finland?
I'd like to start with you with what we just saw from the president. You heard him talking about Vladimir Putin as a competitor. He wouldn't call him a foe. And then on the issue of election meddling, which I think is symbolic of his view toward Russia in general, he says, all I can say is, did you, and don't do it again. Your takeaway.
Nothing new there, John. These have been the kind of soft touch of the president with respect to President Putin. And in many ways, the strategic framework within which all of this fills. The denigration of NATO, in effect, the creation of real tensions within the alliance over a money issue, which in the end is probably going to end up exactly where it was when he began, even though he'd like to take personal credit for it. And a visit to the UK, in which clearly there are troubles in the UK and with Mrs. May. And he hasn't shown much either sympathy or capacity to be helpful in underpinning the particularly important relationship of our most stalwart traditional ally in Europe, along with denigrating Germany. And so he has a capacity here to do a three-strike disaster for American strategic interest in leading the world, in keeping the European framework behind us, and Putin would be the icing on the cake. Does he give away, in fact, Baltic exercises? Does he undo the kinds of things that are very important to us in maintaining the relationship over the Ukraine and indeed Crimea? What does he get in return? It's a little bit like the Kim Jong-un time, where he gives away U.S. exercises with the Republic of Korea with seemingly nothing in return except a smile from Kim. So we're in a situation in which seemingly U.S. interests and U.S. strategy is very much at stake, and the president seems to be very much motivated and continue to be by reality television and ego building, not a sense clearly of how and in what way the U.S. as leader of the world can continue to provide that kind of benign, helpful, cooperative, and indeed energetic and indeed progressive leadership that we have been known for and which he has over the last year and a half been undoing piece by piece.
Let's discuss a little bit. What does the president have to accomplish with this Putin meeting?
Well, he has to do two things. Number one, he has to build relations with Russia as good as they possibly can be in this competitive world with Russia. And two, he has to do so in a way that doesn't antagonize our alliances. And that's a tightrope to walk. I think he's going to lean on the Russian side of that tightrope.
Why is that?
Because he wants to. President Trump has had this fascinating fascination with strongmen. You heard it in the campaign when he talked about Saddam Hussein knew how to take care of terrorists. I mean, there's always been something about Donald Trump that's a throwback to the 50s, when America's grandest alliances were with thugs around the world to fight communism and preserve peace. There's something about Donald Trump that likes that. It makes me weary. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't develop relations with Russia. They're a superpower. The better relations are with Russia within bounds, the better. But I'm hesitant about developing relations with Russia because Russia's a bad actor around.
I agree Russia's a bad actor. I don't trust Russia. I just don't. I don't take them at their word when they say they didn't screw around with the election.
Absolutely.
But I also, I don't subscribe to this isolationism either. And I think if there's something mutually beneficial, whether it's fighting terror or some economic benefit, you have to find it. And if you don't find it, then compete with them. You know, we should be sending natural gas to Germany.
Absolutely. And this is where President Trump's remarks this morning about Germany being captive is the wrong word. But by saying they're dependent on Russia when you shouldn't be, Trump's 100% right. I remember George Bush making that case in 2002 to Gerhard Schroeder, the Chancellor of Germany at the time, when they turned off all their nuclear energy. And Bush bluntly said to Schroeder, you might as well turn your energy needs over to Russia. You might as well just depend on them. Now, Trump, in his strong ways, says captive to Germany. He's right on the point. He overstated the word and therefore got everybody in a huff and a puff.
Is there a way of getting this European alliance back to baseline?
Well, I salute Donald Trump for calling on the NATO alliance to spend 2% on GDP.
Yeah.
Look, in
There's no reason we should be spending all the money on NATO defense.
And there's every reason that they should.
Yes.
And they won't.
The proximity
And
being a very good reason.
And it's a military alliance. Militaries need to be prepared to fight. They just don't want to do that. They just want to have an alliance.
Yeah, they want cradle-to-grave socialism, which is very expensive.
That's it. They don't want guns and butter, but they want Americans to provide the guns while they provide the butter. Trump is the one guy who comes along and says, enough is enough. We don't do that anymore.
Yep, enough of your butter. I got a better batter. Ari Fleischer, thanks so much for being here. Always good to see you. Fleischer Communications. Who knew?
Former spokesman for British Prime Minister Tony Blair is here with me in London. Again, the president due to arrive in the UK in about an hour. Back to Vladimir Putin for a second. I am curious, from the standpoint of Europeans, from the standpoint of people in the UK, when you look at how the president deals with Vladimir Putin, what do you all see?
We see a very strange relationship that seems to have developed. That it developed before they'd even met, so far as we know. And I think we do, you know, I've got to be careful because I'm very much in the kind of anti-Brexit brigade and anti-Trump as well. But I think we do see it partly in that context of the meddling, as you called it in your introduction. There is this sense of why is he so seemingly unwilling to criticize somebody that actually is, by any standards, a figure of dictatorship rather than a figure of democracy. And I think partly I see somebody who is actually a little bit jealous of the dictator. You know, I think most Brits, and as far as I know them, see Trump as a narcissist. It's all about him. I mean, even in that press conference where he said, they all said thank you to me. Well, they didn't. I know that. They didn't all say thank you to him. I think they were all a bit stunned by the way that he behaved this morning. And he said the thing about, you know, British people like me. Well, some might, but most don't. But it's all this sense of it's about him. And I agree with what the ambassador said. He's still in this reality TV show. And he's projecting himself as the main star the whole time. Now, it's very effective in terms of making himself the person. We're doing it now, the person the world talks about. And he loves that. But I agreed with every single word that the ambassador said there. In terms of securing what you imagine, what we imagine America's strategic interest to be, I don't think he's done that. And I think he's heading here. Those other leaders are all heading back to their countries, thinking, as George Bush said, that was some weird stuff.
That's just days ahead of his first official summit that we're going to see in Helsinki with Vladimir Putin. What do you think all the talk will be about between them, those two, and what, if anything, are the NATO allies saying, do you think?
Well, again, Donald Trump is all bluster and bluff. He's attacking China right now. He's imposing sanctions. Then he says, but I have a great relationship with Xi Jinping, and I require him to help me in North Korea. He says to the Europeans, you have to pay more so we can defend you against Russia. Then he says they're actually slaves of Russia because they get energy resources. But now he's going to meet with Putin, who he says he wants better relations. This is bluster and bluff. Donald Trump, the only thing you can count on with Donald Trump is count on nothing. Count on him saying the exact opposite of what he said yesterday. And actually, I don't think Donald Trump cares.
Well, you know what, Brett? I would go as far as to say holy smokes, he's like every other politician that speaks out of both sides of their mouth. So.
Well, that's true, but it has a hyperbolic, extenuated position when it comes to Donald Trump.
Certainly.
Ambassador Pickering, that news conference we held, it was President Trump declaring victory in a way over America's greatest allies, which is interesting in and of itself, isn't it?
It is, because, in fact, they're the bedrock of the kind of relationship in the world that we would hope to create and press forward with. And making that bedrock a transactional issue totally defined by percentages of money provided in a situation in which others have clearly been working on that, but it becomes all about me and what I can achieve and how and in what way I can broadcast from this impromptu press conference the kind of victory I'd like to push for myself before the American people. And unfortunately, the American people don't like to get complicated with data and statistics and complicated issues of that sort. And so he has a natural advantage in his experience in reality television in being able to push ahead with this kind of thing. But the clear question is, what are our strategic interests? How is he promoting those interests? And why and how is that going to make this a better country, a better community of allies and friends, and a better world for all of us. And I think he fails on all of those questions, and unfortunately not enough people are asking them. And we are at a critical stage now in the Trump presidency, where in fact the foreign policy approaches of President Trump are clearly undermining the national interests of the United States, our friends and allies, and as I said a moment ago, the international community. And we should be very, very careful about this.
I was speaking to the former U.S. ambassador to NATO, Victoria Nuland, and she's also written that this summit and then the summit with President Putin will either show America's commitment to leadership of the Western alliance, or it will kill off American leadership. She was very concerned by the sort of disarray that the meeting started with, the back and forth between you all over the breakfast. And she sort of suggested that this was music to Putin's ears, this discord, and that in her words to me, President Trump's sort of disruption of this alliance, for whatever reasons he wants to do that, leaves those on the opposite side of the fence, quote, drooling. Are you concerned about his position going into the meeting with Vladimir Putin?
President Trump has a different style. He is very direct, but I think also that has helped allies to really hear his message, especially on burden-sharing defense spending. I welcome the fact that he will meet with President Putin, because I have been strongly in favor of dialogue, or NATO is strongly in favor of dialogue with Russia. For us, dialogue is not a sign of weakness. Dialogue is a sign of strength. So as long as we are united and as long as we are firm in our approach to Russia, we should also sit down and talk to Russia, partly to aspire for a better relationship with Russia. But even without the better relationship with Russia, we need to manage a difficult relationship with Russia. So when tensions are high, as they are now, it's even more important to talk. We have more military presence along our borders. We need to avoid incidents, accidents, miscalculations, and therefore we need military lines of communications and dialogue with Russia just to make sure that we try to keep tensions down and avoid incidents and accidents.
So let me just get your reaction to two things President Trump said during his press conference. One, that he was open to potentially considering permanent annexation of Crimea by Russia, that Russia's claim to own Crimea now, he could consider potentially accepting that. And two, that he might also consider calling a halt to the joint NATO exercises around the Baltics, those very important exercises there. What is your reaction to that?
Well, we had a very good meeting with President Poroshenko, where we reiterated our strong support to Ukraine, to the territorial integrity, to the sovereignty of Ukraine, and that, of course, includes Crimea. And all allies have expressed again and again that we do not and will not recognize the illegal annexation of Crimea. When it comes to exercises, actually what we do now is that we are exercising more together. I think we have to understand that the military presence of NATO forces and US forces together in NATO and US forces together in Europe, it's partly about protecting Europe, but Europe is also important for projecting stability beyond Europe into Middle East, Africa. So the US presence in Europe is also about power projection for the United States beyond Europe.
So just explain that for the sake of American voters, because President Trump is always saying that the Europeans, the allies, get much, much, much more out of NATO than the US does. You wrote an op-ed saying that you live in Brussels, not far from some of the bloodiest battlefields of World War II, and how that has convinced you of a number of issues in this regard. So what would you say to the American people about the value of NATO for them?
So NATO is important for Europe, but NATO is also important for North America and the United States, because NATO is an alliance that provides friendship, also 28 friends and allies of the United States, meaning that European soldiers and Canadian soldiers have been together with US soldiers on battlefields from Korea in the 50s, Afghanistan and Iraq today. And the presence of US forces in Europe helps to protect Europe, but it's also the platform that the United States has used to project power into the Middle East or Africa. The US-Africa Command is in Europe. So Europe is important also beyond the US presence of military forces in Europe is important also to address crisis far beyond Europe. Then there are forces, infrastructure, bases, intelligence in Europe, which also help to protect the United States. So we are together, and as long as we are together, we are safe and secure. NATO allies together represent half of the world's military might and half of the world's economic might. So as long as we are together, we are able to deal with any potential threat and challenge.